We're live now.
Good morning. This is Mark Gornflow, one of the learning facilitators for the Berkeley Executive Education Digital Transformation course. Welcome to our live webinar with Professor Samir Srivastava of the Haas School of Business. Just a couple of logistics notes as we get started with today's live webinar. First of all, we'd like to welcome the folks from our Latin American section who are joining us via simultaneous translation. If you could select in your Zoom webinar chat box in the bottom left corner, you can select the to panel. Make sure that that's set to all panelists and attendees so that all of us could see any comments that you have. Also, if you have questions at any time during the webinar, please use the Q&A function of Zoom. It's much easier for us to keep track of all the questions and answer as many of them as we can. Additionally, when you joined the webinar this morning, you should also have a SurveyMonkey survey that has popped up. And if you could fill that out when the webinar is finished, that will help us improve future webinars for this class and for future iterations of the class. And with that as a preface, let me say good morning to Samir Srivastava. Samir, how are you?
I'm doing all right, Mark. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to this morning's webinar, so please take it away.
Great. Thank you again, Mark. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar on the people and organizational implications of digital transformation. We are, of course, going through an unprecedented time in the world right now, and I understand that as a result of some of what's happening with shelter in place and other changes and disruptions, that some of you have not yet engaged with the module on people and organizational implications. I will try to slow down and cover some of the topics that are in there as we go through this webinar so that we're all on the same page as we move forward. What I want to do in the hour that we have today is the following types of things. First, I want to just motivate this focus on the importance of the people and organizational implications of a digital transformation by just surveying some recent news articles and thinking about what are some of the challenges that people in organizations are facing, what are some of the opportunities as well. And then, although many of you will go through the Tate Art Gallery's digital transformation case when you do the module, I want to do a second mini case. And this is a mini case about DBS Bank and its transformation. And I want to use that to have a little bit of an interactive case discussion about a digital transformation. Then for those of you who have gone through the module, you'll notice that among the pieces of content that I cover is the use of digital trace data to develop new ways of measuring culture. When I say digital trace data, I mean all the different ways in which people leave digital traces about the culture of an organization, whether it's when they're communicating in emails or sending Slack messages, or in the example that we'll cover today, leaving reviews of their organizations on organizational rating sites such as Glassdoor. And then finally, we'll conclude with some Q&A. I could imagine that some of the questions that you have to do with how to think about a digital transformation that may have gotten disrupted in the time of COVID-19, and I'm happy to field questions about that or anything else that comes up. Okay, so with that, why don't we dive right in? And I see that on the chat, people are saying hello from all around the world. So again, welcome to all of you. Okay, so let's turn to one of the first examples, and I think it's worth thinking about the fact that when we use the phrase digital transformation, we're often thinking about really high-tech industries and really high-tech sectors of the economy. But I want to start with perhaps one of the oldest professions that exists, which is farming. And what's interesting, this is an article that talks about how high tech is transforming one of the oldest jobs in the world, farming. And this push towards a digital transformation in farming is driven by the need to deal with the chronic shortage of labor. And one of the ways in which this is manifesting is through a push for driverless farming equipment. So we hear a lot about autonomous vehicles in the context of electric cars and Tesla and so on. But it turns out that there's also a very big push towards automation in just farming equipment. And there's a firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area called Bear Flag Robotics, which has been adapting the sensors and actuators that are needed for driverless plowing to existing tractors, right? So they're taking technology that's often been developed for cars on roads like LiDAR and radar and retrofitting it to farming equipment and allowing 24/7 plowing, for example, of farms. This is pretty fundamentally transforming productivity in the farming industry. Relatedly, IBM recently purchased the weather company. And the idea there is to bring supercomputing capabilities, weather prediction, and crop management. And if you think about what it takes to both operate equipment like that, as well as to harness insights from supercomputing, it really does require a very different set of skills in farming. So the National Future Farmers of Association, Future Farmers of America organization launched an online educational platform to prepare its over 700,000 members for the coming transformation in agriculture. All right, the next example I want to turn to is from The Gap, which is obviously a retailer in the apparel domain. And recently their CEO stepped down rather abruptly. So what's interesting about Art Peck's background is before he became CEO, he was serving as the digital chief for Gap. And then he was tapped to be the head of the overall enterprise. And he was charged with pushing this organization, which has been historically known as a mall store operator, into the digital age, given that consumers are increasingly browsing for items on smartphones. But it has proven to be a real challenge to revive the sales at their flagship brands, which are both Gap and Banana Republic, while pushing into digital properties. And the result of that is that the shares of the company fell over 30% in 2019, and Peck was abruptly forced out. Another cautionary tale comes from State Street Bank. This is another truly historic organization that traces its origins back to 1792. And they recently made a big push to expand beyond their core business of fund accounting to a more sophisticated suite of services such as data analytics and money management. As their former CEO said, you can sit back and let technology disrupt you, or you can embrace technology and disrupt yourself and move yourself to the next phase of growth. They launched something called Project Beacon, which was designed to cut over $550 million in costs by eliminating low-skilled jobs or moving them offshores. But despite this investment, the shares of State Street fell 34%, and the firm announced it was going to lay off over 15% of its senior managers. Okay, the next one I want to turn to is HireVue. And this is an example of a kind of technology that has the potential, at least, to fundamentally transform one of the core processes in organizations. And what HireVue does is to allow people to scale interviewing and to do so in a more fair and consistent manner. At least that's the value proposition. So the idea, HireVue is currently being used to interview 1 million people every 90 days. Firms can set questions that candidates can answer on their cameras through a laptop or smartphone. And HireVue then has a bunch of algorithms that predict who's going to be a good fit, predict who's going to be successful. And once you have such a predictive algorithm, it's not surprising to see that people try to outsmart the algorithms. And so we see career counselors at universities who are working to find out which companies are using AI and then trying to coach students on ways to beat the algorithm. So the value proposition, as I mentioned, for HireVue is they claim that you can interview people at scale and do so in a way that's less biased than a typical human interviewer would be. But there's a lot of skepticism about the extent to which that is truly effective. And a UNC career counselor states, everyone makes snap judgments on applicants when first meeting them. But what worries me about AI is that AI can't tell the heart of the person and the drive a person has. And Arvind Narayanan, a CS professor at Princeton, says he believes in the potential of AI, but also questions its ability to predict outcomes, like social outcomes of who's going to be successful in a job, particularly when that job is involves interaction with others. There was a question that came up in the chat about whether these slides can be shared, and Jen will go ahead and share the slides after we're all done. Okay, the last motivating example I want us to think about is this idea of a flash organization. And this is the kind of tool that I think can pretty fundamentally change even what an organization looks like going forward. And the idea here is that with a flash organization is that you can create a temporary structure, and the temporary structure can bring together freelancers who've never met before to complete a complex and interdependent task, and then to disband when the project is done. So freelancing, of course, and gig work has been around for a long time. What's different here is that whereas most freelance work is done individually on a bounded, independent task, with flash organizations, we can now have complex interdependencies, which might play out over periods of time. We can have formal structures that get put in place, reporting relationships, incentives, all the kinds of things that we see in large established organizations, but that are in place in this very temporary structure, which then just goes away when the work is done. And there are really important questions that come up about how you think about motivating people in these structures, how you think about managing performance, how you think about career progression when people are in these kinds of structures. And that's going to pretty fundamentally change how we think about leadership in these settings. So Michael Bernstein, who developed a platform called Foundry, where one can do this, said, computation has the opportunity to dramatically shift several costs in a way that traditional organizations haven't realized. It's way easier to search for people, bargain, and contract with them on these kinds of platforms. So I mentioned Foundry is one of these platforms. Another organization that does this kind of work is called Gigster. And I won't have time today to tell you about this research project, but colleagues of mine and I have a research study looking at communication of virtual teams on the Gigster platform, where we can measure the degree of diversity that gets expressed in communications amongst team members and the implications of that diversity for team performance, because we have access not only to the outcomes of these teams, but also to all of the internal communications that take place amongst the team on Slack. And I'll say a little bit more about how one can use such platforms to help you to develop these kinds of measures and to measure culture and other facets of team performance using digital trace data. Finally, before I turn, one other question that came up from Haseen is, how long do flash organizations typically last? A few months or a few years? The answer is it varies, but what I've seen thus far is more like a few months. So in the case of Gigster that I just mentioned, a typical project might last 3 to 6 months, closer to like a consulting engagement than to a more enduring structure. And that's part of what allows these flash organizations to be as effective as they can be, to get really spooled up very quickly. And Mark is reminding us to use the Q&A function of Zoom for questions. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say by way of setup and just to kind of get the juices flowing as we then dive into the DBS Bank case. So I'm going to very briefly describe the case context. Then I'm going to preview the discussion questions that I want you to start thinking about as we go through this case. Then I'll walk through the case and then I'll come back to the discussion questions. So in terms of context, DBS Bank was founded in 1968. It started off as a very specific bank to Singapore and has grown to become rather large and significant in the region. It's the largest bank by assets now in Southeast Asia. And one of the things that they recognized is that a younger and mobile-centric Asian consumer base was looking for a very different way to engage with its bank. Piyush Gupta took over as CEO in 2009, and he invested a fair amount of money to drive a digital transformation. So they went from $600 million in technology spend annually to over $800 million, have since ramped that up. And to stay relevant, they decided that they have to put technology right at the core of banking and to rewire the entire organization for a digital era. So their head of group technology and operations said, the point about moving to information and mobile is that we need to rethink how our business model is going to change. It's not just about developing mobile apps, but about rethinking the entire organization. How do you rewire an organization for mobility? And Mark, was there a question there in the Q&A? Here's one. Okay, Lorraine asks, do you think Flash organizations may face more opportunity or obstacle due to the COVID-19 crisis? So a quick response on that, Lorraine, is it remains to be seen, but my intuition is that this is a time when you'll likely see a growth in Flash kinds of organizations, particularly as the shelter-at-home edicts are still in place. It's a lot easier to get collaborative work to happen through these kinds of platforms than to require people to come in. So I would imagine this is a time when we're likely to see some growth in this kind of entity. All right, let me then preview these questions. So as I go through the next several pieces of content, I'd like you to think about the following 3 questions. So what are some reasons to think that the DBS transformation will ultimately prove to be a success story? What do you think they're doing well? Conversely, what doubts or concerns do you have about their approach to date? And then finally, if you were advising Piyush Gupta, the CEO, what specific changes would you encourage him to make this transformation be more effective? So keep those in mind as I walk through what they've done thus far. Okay, so they think about their transformation using the language of pillars. And each pillar has a set of actions associated with it. So the first pillar was really about reorganizing technology and operations. And one of the choices they made is to bring together, to kind of structurally merge the 2 groups, technology and operations, and to create within this joined group subunits that were aligned to the various business lines. For example, consumer banking or institutional banking, as well as subunits that were aligned to the geographic markets. The goal of this reorganization was to push technology and operations closer to customers. And in the course of doing that, they also undertook a fair amount of process redesign to cut out inefficiencies, and that resulted in the elimination of 240 million hours of customer wait time. In tandem, they made a number of investments in collaborative technology. So for example, a video presence conferencing system to facilitate coordination across the business lines and geographies. And they also tried to create a cultural shift within technology and operations. The idea was to encourage the TNO employees to be able to feel more comfortable giving direct feedback to the CEO and to senior leadership. They, in the past, have been reticent to speak up. And so one of the ways they did this was by creating an internal portal called Tell Piyush, where employees could give this direct feedback right to the CEO. The second pillar had to do with building a scalable technology platform. And the idea here is that they had multiple platforms around the world. And this was obviously not very scalable, not very efficient. They said beforehand that if you were to go around to the different countries, you'd see that we do things differently in every place. We don't even have consistent technology platforms across these countries. So what they did instead is to put in place a new core banking system called Finacle, which was deployed across 12 countries in 28 months. And they tried here to strike a balance between standardizing applications wherever possible, but leaving some room for local customization and flexibility. The key to doing this, and this is one of the kind of core things that those of you who have gone through the People and Organizations module have already heard about, and those of you who haven't will soon hear about, is they really focused on decision rights. And decision rights are, as a reminder for those of you who've gone through the content, ways to spell out who plays what role in the critical decisions of the organization. And one of the keys is to spell out the so-called management rights and the so-called control rights. And the idea is to push the management rights down to the people who have the best knowledge or expertise to make those choices, but to retain control rights with someone else who can think about the trade-offs and interdependencies that arise when decisions get made. So in the case of standardization, the idea is to push the management rights into the local markets, but to retain outside of the local markets more centrally these control rights to veto customization choices that might not make sense or that might create unnecessary cost or that are duplicative with customization that may have happened elsewhere. And by spelling out those rights very carefully, they were able to strike this balance in a way that was quite effective. Later, they launched new wealth management and mobile banking platforms, again, striving for this balance between standardization and protocols to deal with deviations. All right, the third pillar had to do with the customer experience. And one of the choices they made here, and this is something we'll come back to in the discussion, is they created an overlay structure, which they called a customer experience council. What do I mean by an overlay structure? Well, this was not a reorg, rather it was, let's keep the existing structure in place, but we're going to put in place a new council or task force or cross-functional team which sits atop the existing structure. So this Customer Experience Council was chaired by the CEO, Piyush himself. And the new head of customer experience was made to report to the head of global technology and operations. This too is a choice that I'd like to hear your views about. It's a controversial choice, right? The head of customer experience is reporting to the head of technology and operations. And the idea, as the head of TNO said, is that digital banking goes beyond creating mobile apps or enabling transactions. It's about leveraging world-class technology to create a first-class customer experience. So previously, of the 86,000 customer touchpoints DBS had, in only about 20,000 of the cases was data tracked on why customers reached out. They moved from that to beginning to track these customer needs and pain points much more systematically. And they introduced predictive analytics to reduce ATM cash outs by over 90% and voice analytics to improve the call center experience. And finally, they developed a new branch model, which included the first SMS queue service in Singapore. The idea here is that when you went to the service, you'd be assigned a queue number and an estimated wait time. And so when you then did show up in the branch, you were much more engaged, and that resulted in double-digit sales growth for the investment products sold at branches. Finally, the last platform, last pillar was about technology-driven innovation. And here they created another overlay structure. So I just described previously the Customer Experience Council. In the fourth pillar, they created an Innovation Council, another overlay on the organization that was again chaired by the CEO. And the Innovation Council directly oversaw the development of a set of mobile banking and e-payments initiatives, for example, a mobile wallet for peer-to-peer fund transfers via smartphones, and Home Connect that allowed users to point their device at any building and get a valuation of that building. They also set up alliances with IBM Cognitive Computing and Singapore's A-Star Institute to develop advanced analytics capabilities. And they started thinking about where to source talent in new ways. So they started to, for example, look at a fintech accelerator program in Asia for new places to find talented employees. And then finally, in terms of people development, they thought about some new ways of doing that. For example, hackathons, where they had DBS employees who were partnered with external people, and they worked together to develop prototypes to solve future banking challenges. So as you'll see, a theme in this fourth pillar was trying to get DBS to be much, much more outwardly focused, as opposed to trying to just share best practices around technology within the organization. They were increasingly trying to look outside for those insights. Okay, so let's now open it up for some discussion. And let's start with the first question. So what do you see DBS doing well so far? What are the positive aspects of the change that you would identify?
And Samir, the students can make these comments in the chat box.
The chat, great. Okay, so I see that Turkle talks about a clear vision, and I think that's well said. Piyush and the leadership team here clearly had a strong sense of the direction they were taking, and quite a bit of alignment in what they were trying to do. Sylvain talks about the CEO being directly involved, and when the CEO is directly involved in the way that Piyush was, it sends a very clear signal. This is not just the initiative du jour. The CEO himself or herself is pretty deeply engaged. A few other comments that have come up. Having the customer success team is the most important change, says Malini. And you can see the importance of that, having a council focused on the customer. The direct communication to the CEO and open listening, says Zohaib. I would agree with that assessment as well. Gautam talks about how customer centricity seems to be the core of what they want to do, also using data to drive customer delight in their new initiatives. Again, well said. Cyrus talks about access and involvement of the CEO, including direct feedback. Roberta talks about cross-functional teams. I think that's important to stress here, right? Because what we're talking about in this transformation is not something that can be undertaken by just the technology function or just by one entity. It requires changing the way that work gets done, changing the way that the organization is engaging with the client and customers. And so that involves getting all participants in the organization involved. William talks about putting the customer at the center of the business by having a head of customer experience and having that person report to the head of technology. So William sees that choice as a positive feature. We'll come in a minute to whether others might disagree with William on that point. Sukesh talks about bringing T&O closer to the customers. I think that is an important theme in a lot of digital transformations, is that the technology function, the CIO function, needs to move away from being a back office function to becoming a front office kind of function. Open, transparent culture, Gautam talks about. Matt talks about the continued focus and investment needed beyond the initial push. So we'll come back to Matt's comment in just a minute as well. David speaks about the customer-focused and data-driven approach, again, echoing some themes that we've heard. Jiju talks about the partnership with digital companies like IBM, again, the importance of looking outside the organization. Cyrus talks about, again, the outside engagement, having customers and external stakeholders involved in the hackathons. And Mark talks about, Mark, as I think, as getting us to the next topic, which we'll turn to in a minute, which is maybe there's a need for more overlay structures to increase cooperation, that these changes might not go far enough. So Mark, will come back to your comment in a minute. Matt talks about, on the flip side, Matt says that he likes the overlay approach because a wholesale reorganization can be really disruptive, and overlay allows you to get some of the benefits of this cross-functional orientation without leading the organization into disarray. Lorraine talks about the engagement of a large group, again, of internal and external resources. Marco says, I think it makes more sense to put the head of CXX under the CEO. CXX should be the very core of the business and not a tech function. So I think speaking there about the T&O function in particular. And let's see, we have a couple more comments here. Zohaib talks about how it's a very proactive way of implementing changes which lead to more innovations. All well said. Okay, with that, let's switch to the second question, which is the flip side. So we've talked about things that they're doing well. What doubts or concerns do you have about their approach to date? And actually, maybe I can go back here and ask Mark Henschel if you'd be willing to say a little bit more. It sounded like you, Mark Henschel, were a little bit skeptical about the structural changes. You said that they've only made slight changes and there's a need for more additional overlay structures. Maybe, Mark, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about that. Meanwhile, Cyrus asked the question, do they have enough talent to pull off all these changes? And Cesar says the organization design is based on functions that could be transposed in the initiatives. The functions and objectives need to be clear and aligned. Cesar, I'm not sure I totally follow that point, so maybe you can say more what you mean by transpose in the initiatives, and maybe a typo, but I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking. Sylvain says, is the collaborative platform to bringing topics to the CEO enough to change the culture of the company? And I think that's a very legitimate question there, Sylvain. If we're talking about creating, for example, a culture of psychological safety, which a lot of the research suggests is really important when you're trying to bring in new ideas and innovation, just having a kind of internal platform in which people can post ideas could be viewed by some employees as just symbolic and not a commitment to a real change. Roberta says, there are too many new layers mirroring existing functions. And I think this question, this concern that Roberta raises is really important. One of the downsides of having overlay structures of the kind that DV has put in is that it has a tendency to confuse the organization about who's really doing what. The decision rights can very easily get blurred. And because of that, you can end up with lots of redundancies, and you can end up with or parts of the organization working at cross purposes. So especially when overlays get put in, it becomes even more important to spell out very clearly the decision rights. Andres says that the lack of integration of the digital elements throughout the organization is a possible problem. And David says, the concern is whether the CEO has the empathy to clearly understand the issues and needs of each cross-functional unit. And again, from the case, we don't know enough about Piyush to know whether he has sufficient empathy. Lorraine says, well, these changes, even if they are overlays, are still creating some real disruption. And I think that's a fair point. Matt says, it would be good to know how the changes have affected the core KPIs, cost, revenues, and customer satisfaction. Also, what's the ROI been on the investment? Those are all good questions to probe further on. Marco says, many similar organizations are adopting an agility at scale. They need org design to drive further collaboration, accountability, and empowerment. I think that connects with Mark's comment on the structural overlay. Okay. David also says, I've not also heard about user acceptance testing as core to an iterative approach to a growth-driven strategy. Gautam says the CEO seems to be at the crux of all of these changes. And I think Gautam is raising a really important point, at least in the version of the story I've told. There's more to it. This is very much a top-down driven change with the CEO right in the center. The CEO is chairing all of these different councils that I described. And there are some important questions of whether that's going to sufficiently move the needle on the culture of the organization as a whole, and also how dependent this transformation is going to be on just the CEO. So what if Piyush decides, for example, to move on, as Gautam says, will the transformation come to a grinding halt? And might it not be better to distribute some of these responsibilities among the overall leadership team rather than leaving them just to the CEO? William says, since we're talking about banking, were issues such as regulatory risk, data, privacy, and fraud addressed for the changes? And the short answer is yes. I didn't cover them in the short summary. Lena says, well, my concern is about the marketing function. User experience in IT don't have the complete vision that marketing has. And I think that is a real question here, Lena, that by kind of tucking the customer and marketing experiences under technology and operations, are those voices going to be heard sufficiently? Are they going to be somewhat suppressed? I think that's a real question to think about here. Turkle says, is there a risk that the CEO becomes too operational if he or she drives a transformation? I think that is a legitimate question. These councils are going to be dealing with some very tactical issues. And the question that comes up is, if Piyush is spending all of his time on these councils, who's thinking about the next round of strategy, the next phase of transformation beyond this one? And let's do one last comment, which is from Sukesh. He says, my concern is around technology innovation. In hackathons where outsiders are being involved to come up with new solutions, sometimes it could expose the company's core competencies and privacy to outsiders, and that could negatively contribute to the whole mission. And Sukesh brings up a very interesting kind of trade-off here, right? We need to engage with the outside world in order to get good ideas in, but there's also a risk that we're exposing some of our best ideas to the outside world and losing out on a competitive advantage. So striking that balance is definitely a tricky one. Okay, so just to wrap up on this discussion, let's turn to the final question. Having thought about both the things they're doing well as the concerns, if you were to give Piyush one or two very specific suggestions on what to do differently, what would you tell him? What would be on your top 2 or 3 list of changes to make?
And Samir, while the students are making comments on those questions, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box that you may want to.
Okay. Yeah. Let me go there. Brenda said, Claudio says, it seems to me that creating cross-cutting structures to enhance the customer experience and innovation, since the transversal structures operate with the functional ones, which ones with the greatest power to promote or delay the transformation? So if I understand that question correctly, it's that we've put in place these overlays, and these overlays are operating alongside the existing structure. So how do we think about the balance of power between the two? And the way I think about that is, again, through the lens of decision rights. So it may very well be that the kind of management rights for some of the day-to-day customer experience and innovation choices should reside within the regular, if you will, organization. But since we're trying to do something very different, we might want to push the control rights, I should say, into these cross-cutting councils, so that they can both push the existing units, but also help the existing units understand trade-offs and interdependencies. And Turkle says, we talk a lot about transformation being led and driven by the top management team, but could you comment on the role of the main board regarding decision rights? And so that's a really good question, Turkle. We haven't talked much about the board. The way I think about it is that the management team, especially the CEO, ought to be developing the digital transformation strategy, right? So what is the vision for where we're trying to go? And what are the high-level choices that we're going to make in terms of where to compete and how to gain advantage in those places? What are we going to do ourselves versus partner out? To lay out all of those kind of high-level choices, it's the responsibility of the board to have control rights over the CEO and to basically monitor progress against that vision and to ratify those choices before they get implemented. Okay, so with that, let's go back to the final question on recommendations for Piyush. And Gautam has one, which is to have a CHRO and the CIO to drive the transformation along with the CEO, or a chief transformation officer. The idea is to, Gautam says, to both signal how important the transformation is by having a CTO, that is transformation officer. And I believe Gautam is also getting at the point about trying to reduce the dependency on just having Piyush do all of it. Jiju says, start from one country for transformation rather than all over the world, prioritize and narrow down. And Jiju, I think that's, I can see the kind of the reasons for thinking about starting with one country, piloting the changes. In the case of a digital transformation, it's sometimes difficult to pilot. And that's because to fundamentally change the way the enterprise works, it often requires every function, every unit having to change the way it works. So piloting in one country can often be a real challenge. But I do understand, and the other difficulty here is that the industry is moving so quickly that for some of these transformations, there just isn't time to pilot and test every aspect of it. There kind of is a need to make pretty fundamental changes simultaneously. David says, I would recommend using social analytics and social listening data to develop customer avatars and journey maps, using data and agile product development to iteratively optimize the digital experience. I think that's a strong recommendation. Lorraine says, maybe pilot things. Again, you can do some amount of piloting, and maybe running multiple pilots across regions is another way to accomplish kind of the idea that Jiju was talking about. Cesar says, create a change management strategy for the transformation path. There was a fair amount of change management that was going on, although, as I mentioned in the story that I told, those features were not highlighted as much. Malini says, having analytics on the usage, satisfaction, case resolution, satisfaction index of the customer. So Malini makes a very good point. Again, in the story I told, I didn't say much about what they were measuring, but for a good digital transformation, you want to have the right set of metrics. And those are often going to be more than the usual suspects of metrics. So thinking about the various ways in which the customer is engaging with the organization, various ways in which employees are finding meaning at work when work is being done very differently. Those are all important things to try to measure. Okay, so then Jessica says, I like David's suggestion. Has this been implemented, and how long would it take social analytics and journey maps to take? David, maybe you can write back to Jessica on that. And let's do one last comment, last couple comments. Zhang Jinli says, build up a test market and select some region to test the digital transformation, get a good result and expand. Again, piloting can be done, but probably have to do multiple pilots in multiple regions simultaneously rather than doing it all just sequentially and slowly. Lorraine questions whether combining tech and ops is the best org design. And you can imagine alternatives to that as well. So you could have separate units, but change the workflow and process that exists between them. Gautam says we need maybe some demonstration cases. I think that's a really important point that Gautam raises that goes to the change management around digital transformation. If you can point to some very concrete examples of how work is being done differently, how customers are engaging differently, and have the metrics to back it up, it can help people see how the vision can play out and then more likely come on board to support it. And Mark finally says, I recommend to set up a core team mixed from all departments to push the change and to bring in new digital ideas. All excellent suggestions. Why don't we stop there? So then just before we leave says, make sure employees are involved in the digital transformation are well trained. Using the same terminology and methodologies can help influence culture change. Well said, Sylvan. Okay, so let's then switch gears in the time we have left. And what I want to do in the remaining time is to talk to you a little bit about research related to measuring culture. And the simple idea here is that when we think about a digital transformation, it almost always involves some degree of culture change. And if we think about the ways in which we have measured culture historically, it's been through surveys. That's been the kind of workhorse of culture measurement, which is, you ask people a series of questions about the culture that exists or the culture that we need in the future. You do various forms of gap analyses, but we know that culture surveys also have some significant limitations, right? They're based on self-reports. And so people may or may not accurately report the culture that exists. They're done at one point in time. You can sometimes do pulse surveys, but it's very hard through surveys to get a dynamic sense of how the culture is changing. And we often don't see how culture gets manifested in people's actual behavior. But just as we're seeing digital transformation changing the way in which work gets done, so we're seeing digital technologies changing the ways in which we can measure organizational change, including culture change. And this is a lot of what my research has been focused on in recent years. And I want to tell you about a recent study that does just this. So the setup for this paper is to think about culture through two very different lenses. One lens for thinking about culture is what we think about as content-based. And this is how we typically think about the culture of an organization. So we might talk about a culture of an organization being focused on innovation or adaptability or being aggressive and so on. And each of those values implies a set of behavioral norms and beliefs. And leaders and organizations will say, well, in order for us to be successful in a digital world, we need to be more flexible and agile and so on. And those are very useful ways of thinking about culture. But there's another way to think about culture, which is what I refer to as distributional, which is independent of what norms or values a given organization is emphasizing. How are those beliefs and norms distributed within and across individuals? And what are the consequences of that for the success of the organization? And so in this paper I'm about to describe to you, the question we ask is, how does having a diversity of norms, values, and beliefs affect organizational success? And the way this has been thought about in the past, in academic research at least, is that diversity creates a kind of double-edged sword. That on one hand, diversity helps people come up with new ideas and to be more creative and innovative, but on the flip side, diversity makes it harder for people to coordinate and execute, and therefore can hurt performance. And so there's often this idea of a kind of diversity performance trade-off. But the kind of core idea of this paper is that that trade-off exists because we've thought about diversity in just one way. And in this paper, we introduce two different ways of thinking about diversity, which, when we think about these two together, allow us to kind of escape this same trade-off. So let me just look at the questions that may have come in here. Okay, no, I think we're good. All right, so in this project, we use data from Glassdoor.com. You could think of Glassdoor as like a Yelp for organizations. So employees go onto Glassdoor and they write a review about their organization. Glassdoor gave us all of their employee reviews from January 2008 to July 2015. Employees in these data set are anonymous, but they're verified. We have data for about 500 publicly traded firms with at least 50 firm quarter reviews. There are over 500,000 reviews. And here we're going to use an unsupervised machine learning method, which is called topic modeling. And we're going to train a model on 1 million sentences in these reviews that explicitly use the word culture or one of its synonyms. And once we've trained the model to identify culturally relevant topics, we're going to apply that model to all of the text and be able to infer when someone is talking about the culture of the organization, even if they aren't using the word culture. That's the kind of key innovation from a measurement perspective. And then we're going to get performance data on firms using CompuStat. So let me say a little bit more about the procedure. So as I mentioned, this is called topic modeling. The specific implementation is called latent direct allocation, LDA. And the idea is to treat the words in reviews as a bag of words. We're going to look at co-occurrences of words. And what we're going to do is to reduce the dimensionality of the data by grouping words that tend to co-occur a lot, and by trying to infer the topics that underlie those words. So we take the many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words, and we reduce them down to a set of topics. And we run the model with 25, 50, 100, 500 topics. It doesn't matter. The results are actually very consistent regardless of how many topics we choose. But essentially, we're going to represent each document, each review as a distribution over these topics. It'll look like this figure you see on the bottom right. So just to give you a specific example, this is a review for VMware. And in Glassdoor, employees go in and they write pros and cons about VMware. Shaded are the words that our model identified as being potentially culturally relevant and related to different topics. And so we can then transform the text of the review into what you see on the right-hand side, a topic probability distribution for that review. So once we've transformed every review into a distribution like you see on the right, we can then derive these two different measures of cultural diversity. So, and this is the idea of escaping the trade-off of diversity by thinking about it in these two very different ways. So one way you could think about diversity is breadth. And the idea here is when the typical person describes the culture of this organization, on average, how many different topics should they use to describe it? So Netflix is famously known for emphasizing 7 core cultural values. And so a typical Netflix review will tend to have many different cultural topics because their culture is by design very broad. Nordstrom, in contrast, has a culture that's really focused on one thing, this customer experience that they're trying to create. And so reviews for Nordstrom tend to be much, much more focused. That's one dimension, and we call it intrapersonal because it's what the average person thinks about when he or she is describing the culture. The second dimension you could think about is dissimilarity between reviews. So here, what I'm thinking about is if I pick any 2 people at random from an organization and I ask them to describe the culture, to what extent will they tend to disagree about what the culture is? And this is a between-person comparison, and hence we call it interpersonal cultural diversity. So just to illustrate this, in panel A on the very left, we see an example of a firm with very low interpersonal diversity. So if I looked at 3 employee reviews, 1, 2, and 3 on the far left, those 3 reviews overlap quite a bit, right? The 3 reviewers agree to a large extent on what the culture is, and therefore there's low diversity there. In contrast, the right-hand side of panel A shows 3 reviews where the reviewers really disagree. They have different cultural topics to emphasize. In panel B, we see the illustration of intrapersonal heterogeneity or diversity. So on the left side of panel B, we see 3 reviews where even though the people disagree, they all are emphasizing one core cultural feature. They actually agree that the culture is about one thing, just disagree on what that thing is. Whereas on the far right, we see that all of the reviewers are describing the culture in a very multifaceted way. They're all talking about 5 different elements, more or less together. That's the way to think about these 2 dimensions. So again, as a reminder, interpersonal is disagreement and intrapersonal is breadth. So what we find if we look at the results is that in panel A, that this interpersonal dimension is negatively related to profitability. So the idea here is that when people disagree about the culture, it's harder for them to coordinate in getting their work done. The lack of coordination makes it harder to execute, and therefore we see a negative relationship with return on assets or profitability. The remaining 3 panels are about the other dimension, this breadth dimension or intrapersonal. And what we find, and the idea here is that when individuals in the organization have a wide range of cultural resources to draw upon, they can recombine ideas more effectively. And in recombining ideas, they're better able to innovate. And we see that in at least 3 different manifestations. So one is market valuation, or as measured by Tobin's Q, which is like a market to book ratio. The other is in patenting, right? So in panel C, we see the firms that have higher intrapersonal heterogeneity, greater breadth of the culture, patent more, and in panel D, those patents have greater impact as measured by backward citations. And so what this suggests is that there is a way to escape the diversity performance trade-off, and that is by dialing up breadth or intrapersonal heterogeneity and dialing down disagreement or interpersonal heterogeneity. So that's the kind of core findings from the paper. We have about 6 minutes left, so I'm happy to take questions people have about either the research or the case or anything else that's on your minds.
Samir, while students think of questions to ask, one question that I always had is how, so these are great findings that you got from this very sophisticated analysis of a huge data set. How can students of digital transformation's personal aspects take these insights on interpersonal and intrapersonal heterogeneity and make changes in their own organizations to promote these kinds of cultural attributes?
Yeah, so I would say that, in terms of intrapersonal, it's about, having a deliberative exercise to think about what are the cultural values that we've had in the past, what are the ones that we think we'll need in the future, and to see if there are opportunities, particularly as you do a digital transformation, to increase the breadth of ideas that are being discussed and promoted. And for interpersonal, it's to make sure that there's alignment about what the culture is. So if you're finding parts of the organization where there is a kind of a different understanding, or people are trying to diverge in their understandings, then being able to go in as a leadership team and try to get everybody back on the same page. There are also tools available to try to measure how cultural change is happening over time. So I've here talked about Glassdoor data, but in other work, and all of the work that I've done on this topic, you can find on my website and the website of the lab that I co-direct, which is called the Computational Culture Lab. But we have a series of projects where we've measured culture using email data, Slack communications, other internal platforms, and you can set these up now in a way that you can still protect employee privacy and confidentiality, but get some aggregate metrics on how the culture is starting to shift as you roll out these changes. And Mark, maybe if you could help me just select some questions to respond to. It seems like we have now a few in the Q&A as well as in the chat.
Turkle asks if there's additional reading material available on examples of transformation gone wrong, perhaps.
So there are lots of examples of transformations gone wrong. What I would recommend is if you go to the Harvard Business School publishing website, there are lots of materials there, and you just type in digital transformation, you'll find lots of case studies there of both successful and also challenging ones.
Great. Gautam asks, does the level of inclusivity in the organization affect the intrapersonal and interpersonal dimensions that you talk about?
Yeah, another good question, Gautam. The short answer is we don't know. So in the data that we were able to get, it was really just external data from Glassdoor matched to performance data. What would be great to do in a follow-on study is to match the external data with internal data on dimensions such as inclusivity to see what practices inside the organization can affect these two dimensions.
Great. And David asks, how do organizations best align divergent stakeholder interests around a digital transformation?
Yeah, so David asks a really good question. I think one way I think about this, David, and this is actually a little bit of a broader point, so maybe we'll conclude on this one. For those of you who are leading a digital transformation, my recommendation is to think of yourself as a student and an agent who operates in the domain of power and politics. And what I mean by that is not the sinister form of power and politics, but the enlightened form, that you're inherently changing the status quo. There are people who are committed to the status quo, who benefit from the status quo, and therefore it's incumbent on you to try to convince them why this change is going to be important for them. So one of the very useful things that I used to do in my prior life when I was a management consultant before I became an academic, and something I do even now, is when I engage with a new organization or I'm thinking about a change effort, is I'll actually write out a stakeholder map, right? So who are some of the key stakeholders? What are their interests? Who influences them? Who are the people they listen to? What are their KPIs? What are they being measured and rewarded on, right? And you can do this across some of the key people. And as you map that out, it often becomes clearer the order and sequence in which you want to engage people, as well as the gives and gets, what resources you have that might be helpful for that person in trying to accomplish what he or she's trying to do, and conversely, what support you need from that person in accomplishing what you're trying to do. So the other kind of, the other term that I think is very useful in thinking about digital transformation is the language of alliances, right? Ultimately, you're trying to sort of stitch together a series of alliances to line these interests together. And that really begins with having a very strong and effective map of the political interests of people in the organization.
Samir, I agree. That's a great topic to end on. Thank you so much for another great live webinar on people in the organization as part of digital transformation. I put the URL for your computational culture lab in the chat box. So if
great.
Go and fish around in there, they can take a look at what you're doing with your academic research. I would also encourage our participants today to fill out the SurveyMonkey form so that we can get feedback on this webinar and all of our webinars to improve them for the future. And Samir, I want to wish you a great rest of the week, and to our students the same as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone for engaging today. Really appreciate it.